The wind over the Kunar Valley moved like something alive that night, restless, shifting, cutting through the pine ridgelines with a low moan that sounded almost human. At 2:47 in the morning, the village of Karkot was completely dark. No generators running. No lanterns. Just the kind of ancient, total darkness that cities had forgotten existed. Nobody heard the shot. That was the first thing that made it strange. A 7.62 NATO round makes a crack, sharp, unmistakable, the kind of sound that wakes sleeping soldiers half a kilometer away. But a .338 Lapua Magnum fired through a specialized suppressor from nearly a mile out arrives before its own sound does. The target is already falling before the air pressure wave reaches the men standing next to him. And by the time those men have spun around, raised their weapons, and started screaming at each other in Pashto, the shooter is already folding herself flat into the hillside like she is part of the earth itself. Commander Rashid Waziri, a Taliban logistics coordinator responsible for moving weapons caches through 3 provinces, crumpled in the doorway of a mud brick compound at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. His security detail of 4 men discharged their weapons in 4 different directions out of pure panic. They hit nothing. There was nothing to hit. The hillside above them was empty. 2 kilometers away, Staff Sergeant Alina Vasquez was already moving. She did not run. Running creates sound, and sound in mountain terrain carries in ways that defy common sense. She moved in a technique she had drilled 10,000 times, low, slow, deliberate, each footfall placed with the care of a surgeon, her weight distributed across the entire sole rather than the heel, her breathing controlled and nasal, her ghillie suit dragging silently through the dry scrub. In the darkness, she was a shadow among shadows. Not invisible exactly, nothing is truly invisible but wrong. The eye slides off her. The brain, looking for human shapes, finds nothing to confirm and moves on. She had been in that position for 61 hours. 2.5 days lying motionless in a shallow depression she had scraped out of the hillside with her hands. She had eaten twice compressed ration bars that required no preparation and produced no smell. She had drunk from a filtered collection bladder. She had urinated into an absorbent pad designed for long-duration surveillance operations. She had not spoken a single word. She had not checked her phone. She had not communicated with anyone. She had simply watched and waited, and when the moment came, she had done what she was trained to do with the same mechanical certainty of gravity itself. Back at the Joint Special Operations Command Forward Operating Base in Jalalabad, a duty intelligence officer was already receiving fragmented reports about an unconfirmed casualty in Karkot. By 4 a.m., satellite imagery tasking was being rerouted over the area. By 6 a.m., a team of analysts had gone through 23 separate signals intercepts and found nothing. No communication spike, no unusual movement signature, no electronic trace of any American asset operating in the area. The incident was logged under a standard administrative designation used when attribution cannot be established. 3 words in the remarks field: unknown kinetic event. No one in that intelligence shop, not the duty officer, not the imagery analysts, not the signals team, had any idea that the shooter was a 29-year-old woman from San Antonio, Texas, who had been operating alone in their area of operations for the past 11 months without appearing on a single duty roster, mission brief, or personnel manifest. Her name was Alina Vasquez. Her rank was staff sergeant. Her unit designation existed only in a compartmented annex of a classified special activities program that required a specific code word clearance to even acknowledge the existence of. She had no call sign. That was not an oversight. That was the architecture. The program she belonged to, never formally named in any document she had ever seen, was built on a single foundational principle that her handler had explained to her during her first week of training, standing in a wooden building at an installation that appeared on no public map, with a cup of bad coffee going cold in his hand. The most dangerous thing in this business, he had told her, is not the enemy knowing your face. It's the enemy knowing your name. A name is a handle. A handle is something they can grab. She had nodded. She had understood. She had internalized it so completely that it had become less a rule and more a way of existing in the world. For 3 years, Elena Vasquez had no name in the field, no call sign on any net, no designation in any communication. She was nothing more than a pattern of results, unexplained, unattributed, quietly effective, that the intelligence community filed away under unknown asset and tried very hard not to think too carefully about. To the men hunting her during those 3 years, the Taliban logistics officers, the weapons facilitators, the mid-level commanders who began to notice that their counterparts were dying in a way that had no tactical explanation, she was something else entirely. They called her a ghost, not metaphorically. They genuinely, superstitiously, whispered among themselves that something supernatural was operating against them, a spirit of the mountains, a jinn that took the form of death from a direction no human being could shoot from. Elena had heard this secondhand. Through a signals intercept translation her handler had passed along 6 months into her deployment. She had read it once, set it down, and never thought about it again. She was not a ghost. She was something considerably more dangerous than a ghost. She was a living woman, rigorously trained, ferociously disciplined, and completely invisible. And she was now 4 kilometers from Karkat, moving through pine forest in the pre-dawn darkness with the easy, unhurried purpose of someone who had already finished the hardest part of the night's work. Her radio, a small burst transmission device smaller than a paperback book, emitted a single 4.3-second encrypted pulse at 5:12 a.m. No recipient acknowledged it. None were supposed to. The message contained 11 characters. Translated out of the one-time pad cipher, it read simply, "Task complete." Then Elena Vasquez disappeared back into the mountains. And no one, not the Taliban, not the NSA, not the analysts in Jalalabad who would spend the next 2 days trying to explain a dead man in a doorway, had any idea she had ever been there at all. 18 months before Rashid Waziri died in a doorway in Karkat, Elena Vasquez had been standing in a cold, fluorescent-lit gymnasium at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, doing something that no one around her considered particularly remarkable. She was shooting. It was a standard qualification course, the kind of routine evaluation that Army personnel completed twice a year, more administrative obligation than genuine assessment. The targets were at distances up to 300 meters. The weather was mild. The conditions were easy. Elena was using an M4 carbine that she had drawn from the armory that morning and had never fired before. She went 40 for 40. That was unusual but not extraordinary. Good soldiers shot clean qualifications. What made the range officer stop and look twice was not the score but the manner. Every other shooter in that gymnasium, Rangers, Special Forces candidates, experienced infantrymen, shot with a visible intensity. You could see them breathing, adjusting, working. There was something muscular and effortful about the way they engaged. Elena shot the way other people blink. She raised the weapon, and the round was already gone before the conscious mind could have completed the decision to fire. Her body had made the calculation, distance, wind, sight picture, trigger break, so far below the level of deliberate thought that it appeared not like skill, but like instinct. Like the rifle was simply an extension of her attention. The range officer flagged her score and sent it up the chain with a note attached. 2 days later, a man Elena had never seen before sat down across from her in a conference room and asked her to describe, in her own words, what she was thinking about when she shot. She thought about the question for a moment. "Nothing," she said, "that's the point." The man, Colonel James Hargrove, though she would not learn his name for another 3 weeks, wrote something in a notebook and asked her nothing else. 6 days later, she received orders she did not understand, to report to a location she had never heard of, with a personnel file that would be transferred to an administrative unit designation that meant nothing to anyone outside a very small room in a very secure building. What followed was the most demanding 18 months of her life, and she had already lived a demanding life. Alina had grown up in San Antonio, the daughter of a Mexican-American army mechanic and a schoolteacher who read military history for pleasure. She had enlisted at 19, volunteered for Ranger assessment at 22, one of the early cohort of women to enter the expanded pipeline, and had made it through the 62-day selection course on her first attempt. She was not the largest candidate. She was not the fastest runner. She was, by her own assessment, thoroughly average in every physical category. But she could be still in a way that made the evaluators uneasy. Not passive, not disengaged, still like a compressed spring, like potential energy in human form, like a person who had found the exact frequency at which the body uses nothing and loses nothing and simply exists in readiness. Her instructors had noted it in different ways. One wrote unusual composure under sustained discomfort. Another wrote appears not to experience boredom. A third had written simply, "Watch this one." Colonel Hargrove had watched her. The training program he ran had no official name. It occupied a facility in the Nevada high desert that appeared, on property records, to belong to a Bureau of Land Management contractor. There were 8 candidates when Alina arrived. There were 4 when the program ended. The attrition was not from failure. It was from choice. 3 candidates withdrew voluntarily, and one was quietly removed after a psychological evaluation raised concerns about judgment under isolation stress. The program did not want people who couldn't quit. It wanted people who chose, with full understanding of what they were choosing not to. Alina chose. The curriculum was unlike any military training she had encountered. Languages came first, not classroom instruction but immersion, 6 hours a day with native speakers, until Pashto and Arabic moved from foreign sounds to something she could think in. She was not expected to become fluent in the literary sense. She was expected to understand what people were saying when they thought no one who mattered could hear them. Wilderness survival came next, and it was not the survival of emergency preparedness. It was the survival of indefinite occupation, how to exist in terrain for weeks without resupply, without shelter beyond what the environment offered, without fire, without the kind of comfort that the human nervous system typically demands before it begins to fracture. She spent 21 days alone in the Nevada desert in August. She spent 18 days in a Montana River valley in February. She spent 14 days in a Louisiana swamp that the instructors described, with dark humor, as the one that makes people miss the desert. She came back from all 3 without requesting early extraction. The sniper schooling was last, and it was where she understood, fully and finally, what she had been built to become. Her primary instructor was a retired British SAS sergeant named Aldous Garrick, a compact, weathered man in his late 50s who spoke slowly and taught without drama. He had been shooting at distance for 30 years. He had forgotten more about the application of long-range precision fire than most people would ever learn. And he had, in Alina, something he told Hargrove over a beer on the program's final evening that he had never encountered in 3 decades of instruction. "She doesn't fight the uncertainty," Garrick said. "Most shooters, even good ones, fight it. The wind is variable, the range is uncertain, the target moves. They feel the uncertainty and they tighten against it. She doesn't. She accepts it as a condition of the problem and she solves around it. I don't know how to teach that. She already had it." On her final program evaluation, Alina engaged a target at 2,100 meters on a crosswind day using a rifle she had been given 20 minutes before the shot. She made it on the first round. Hargrove signed her operational authorization the same afternoon. The one instruction he gave her, the only rule that superseded all others: came as she was leaving the building for the last time. "You have no call sign," he said. "Not ever. Not in the field, not on comms, not to Allied forces, not to anyone. The moment you have a name out there, you have an anchor point. An anchor point is how they find you. Understand?" "Yes, sir," she said. She meant it completely. She walked out of that building and into the landscape of classified operations, and she did not look back. It arrived the way all her missions arrived, not as a briefing, not as a face-to-face meeting, but as a sequence of numbers transmitted in a burst that lasted less than 5 seconds, decoded through a one-time pad that she would burn after reading, translated into a set of geographic coordinates, and a physical description that she committed to memory before destroying the paper. But this one was different from the moment she began to decode it. The target designation was Helios. Unlike the logistics officers and weapons facilitators she had been tasked against before, mid-tier operators important enough to eliminate but replaceable within weeks, Helios was something else entirely. He was described in the intelligence annex as an information convergence broker, which was the kind of bureaucratic language that, once you understood what it actually meant, made your stomach tighten. Helios did not move weapons. He did not command fighters. He moved knowledge, specifically. He moved the kind of knowledge that connected disparate insurgent cells that had no direct communication with each other, allowing them to coordinate operations that appeared unrelated until the pattern emerged in blood. 6 weeks before Alina's tasking arrived, that pattern had produced 23 American deaths and 11 Afghan National Army deaths across 4 apparently unconnected ambushes in 3 provinces. The ambushes were too well-timed to be coincidence. They were too geographically spread to be a single cell's work. Something was connecting them. Helios was the connection. The intelligence on him was maddeningly incomplete. Physical description: male, approximately 45-55 years, medium build, unremarkable features, no identifying marks in any available photograph. And there were only 2 photographs, both taken at distance, both partially obscured. Behavioral profile: extremely security conscious, irregular movement schedule, never stayed in any location more than 36 hours, never used electronic communication of any kind, relied exclusively on physical couriers who themselves had no knowledge of his identity beyond a recognition signal. 3 previous intelligence assets deployed to surveil him had gone silent. One of them had been found. Alina read that last detail twice. She was not afraid. Fear was an emotion she had learned to disaggregate from operational assessment, to acknowledge as data rather than experience. But she noted it the way a pilot notes a warning light. It was information. It meant Helios had his own counterintelligence capability, and that capability was effective. Hargrove's supplemental note at the bottom of the intelligence package was characteristically sparse. 5-day window, standard exfil protocol, no support assets in area, your judgment on approach. Your judgment. 3 words that meant. You are alone, and if something goes wrong, there is no rescue coming that won't compromise everything. She planned for 6 days. The insertion was a HAHO jump. High altitude, high opening. A parachute technique that allowed her to glide nearly 30 kilometers from the aircraft's flight path, so that anyone who tracked the plane's route would find nothing of interest below it. She exited at 28,000 feet over what the aircraft's transponder logged as a routine resupply corridor, wearing an oxygen mask against the cold that at that altitude could kill a person in minutes, and she glided in darkness down toward a landing zone she had memorized from topographic maps studied for 4 hours the previous afternoon. She landed in a dry streambed and immediately stripped her parachute, compressed it into a bag no larger than a backpack, and buried it under 2 feet of gravel in less than 7 minutes. Then she began walking. The route to her intended hide site was 22 kilometers through terrain that included 2 significant ridgelines, 1 active village, and a stretch of open ground that had to be crossed during the narrow window of deepest darkness between moonset and astronomical twilight. She moved at 300–400 meters per hour, slower than a cautious hiker, slower than a patrol, slow enough that her movement signature would not register as human to anyone watching from above. It took 2 nights. During the day between, she lay in a concealed position in a ravine and slept in 20-minute intervals. She reached the limestone ridge, overlooking the road on the morning of the 3rd day. The hide she constructed was a masterpiece of controlled misery, a shallow scrape in the rocky soil, deepened by 6 inches with her hands over the course of 2 careful hours, oriented to eliminate her visible silhouette against the ridgeline. The ghillie suit adjusted to match the specific color and texture of the local vegetation: grayish-green scrub, dry rock, pale dust. She settled into it with the acceptance of someone who has long since made peace with physical discomfort, because discomfort is simply the price of the position, and the position is what matters. Then she waited. The first day passed with nothing on the road below except a farmer's truck and a group of children walking home from a school 3 kilometers distant. Elena watched them through her scope and thought nothing particular about them. They were not the target. They were the world being the world. The second day, a shepherd walked his flock along the base of her ridge. He was close 90 meters below her, close enough that she could hear the bells on the lead animal. He paused once, his eyes moving slowly across the hillside, as shepherds' eyes do, reading terrain the way they have for centuries, looking for predators, looking for the wrong kind of still. His gaze passed directly across her position. He saw nothing. He moved on. Elena exhaled slowly and remained exactly as she was. The 3rd and 4th days brought nothing on the road that matched her target profile. Her rations were nearly depleted. The water collection from the previous night's dew had given her approximately 400 milliliters. She calculated she could sustain the position for another 30 hours at most before the physiological toll began to affect her capability. On the evening of the 5th day, 3 vehicles appeared on the road. She had been watching the road for so long that she had begun to know its rhythms the way you come to know the rhythms of a person you live with. The bend where trucks always slowed because the gravel was loose. The stretch where local vehicles hugged the right edge from habit. The particular way the afternoon light moved across the valley floor, shifting the shadows of the ridgeline eastward until the road fell into the last long shade of evening. She saw the convoy before she heard it. 3 vehicles, a lead pickup truck running without headlights despite the dying light, a white Land Cruiser in the middle, a second truck at the rear. They were moving at the careful pace of people who know that roads in this country are not always what they appear to be. The spacing between vehicles was deliberate, not the random spacing of civilian travel, but a practiced interval that kept the convoy spread enough to survive a single IED blast. This was a security detail that had thought about surviving. Elena did not move. She had not moved significantly in 11 hours. Her body had achieved the metabolic economy of deep stillness, heart rate in the low 50s, breathing shallow and regular, the fine motor tremor that fatigue produces in an unsupported shooting position, controlled through a technique her SAS instructor had called finding the floor, not fighting the tremor, but sinking through it into the deeper stillness beneath. She watched the convoy through her scope. The center vehicle was the right vehicle. She had established that from the behavioral pattern, the way the security detail in the front truck mounted up when they halted, the direction they oriented when they scanned. They were protecting the middle, but she needed more than probability. She needed confirmation. Hargrove had been precise on this point during her training, and it was the one rule she held above all technical considerations. You confirm the target beyond the intelligence picture. You don't shoot a man because a photograph looks right. You shoot him because you know. The convoy slowed as it reached the bend. The Land Cruiser's rear door opened, and a man stepped out briefly, spoke to the driver of the following truck, and got back in. That was enough. It wasn't the face, The light was failing and the range was nearly a mile and a half. It was the posture, the way the security detail reorganized itself around him in the 3 seconds he was outside the vehicle, the way the man in the truck's passenger seat tracked him with the attentive anxiety of a professional guardian. The body language of the people around a target tells you more than a photograph. People can disguise their own appearance. They cannot disguise the way other people treat them. Elena settled her cheek against the stock. Range, 1,847 meters confirmed on the laser. Wind at the firing point, 11 knots from the northwest, variable. She had been tracking the wind using 3 reference points for the past 2 hours, a distant flag visible through the scope, a dust eddy on the valley floor, the movement of dried brush on the near slope, and she had built a model of the wind column between herself and the target. Not a perfect model. There was no perfect model at this distance. There was only the best model available, and the discipline to commit to it. She dialed her corrections, she breathed, she found the floor. The target's vehicle had slowed almost to a stop at the bend. She squeezed the trigger in the way that Garrick had spent weeks teaching her, not pulling, not jerking, but increasing pressure with such gradual, continuous intention that the break came as a mild surprise to the conscious mind, because the conscious mind is the enemy of the shot, and the body must do this work without it. The rifle moved. The suppressor bled gas in a controlled pulse that reduced the sound to something a person standing 50 meters away might mistake for a thrown rock. The round left the barrel at 930 meters per second. 2.1 seconds. The target's door window starred and collapsed inward. The convoy erupted. The rear truck's occupants bilayed immediately, taking cover behind the vehicle, weapons up, scanning. The front truck accelerated forward 30 meters and stopped sideways across the road. Men shouted. Weapons discharged, 4 separate shooters, firing in 4 separate directions, none of them toward the ridge. The confusion was total. Elena was already moving. She had established 3 exfil routes before she settled into the hide, a necessary discipline, because the moment a shot is fired, the hide is no longer a hide. It is a location, and a location is somewhere that people will eventually look. The question is not whether they will find where you were. The question is whether you are still there when they find it. She took the second route, not the easiest, not the fastest, but the one that crossed terrain so difficult that a rational search pattern would deprioritize it. A 40-degree slope of loose shale, a dry canyon that narrowed to the width of a person's shoulders, a kilometer of exposed ridge that she crossed on her belly, using the darkness and the enemy's psychological fixation on low ground as cover. 3 kilometers out, she paused behind a boulder and ran her hands methodically over the equipment. Everything present, nothing left behind. Her brass was already in the bag at her hip. She had caught it by hand as it ejected, as she always did, leaving nothing at the firing point that hadn't been there before she arrived. She transmitted at 5:12 a.m. 11 characters. Burned the one-time pad with a lighter she carried for exactly this purpose, crushing the ash between her fingers until nothing legible remained. Then she kept walking, and the mountains received her, and she was gone. In the morning, intelligence analysts in Jalalabad noted an unconfirmed report of a casualty in a valley near the Pakistani border. The report was assessed as credible. The cause was listed as unknown. Helios was dead. The cells he connected began to fragment within 2 weeks. Nobody knew her name. Nobody ever would. Or so she believed. The mistake was small. The smallest mistakes always are. Her name was Specialist Karen Akafar, and she had been working in the NSA's Forward Signals Intelligence element at Bagram for 14 months. She was 24 years old, extraordinarily good at her job, and possessed of a habit that her supervisor had noted approvingly in her last performance evaluation. She kept meticulous personal notes on anomalous patterns, cross-referencing signals data in ways that went beyond her assigned tasks, building informal databases of her own out of pure analytical curiosity. It was this habit that caused everything that followed. For the past 8 months, Akafar had been privately tracking a pattern that she found deeply strange. 3 times in 8 months, within hours of an unexplained kinetic event, the kind logged as unknown in official records, she had detected an identical signal signature. A burst transmission, 4.3 seconds, encrypted beyond her team's ability to break, originating from a position consistent with an elevated sniper hide site relative to the event location. The signature was not identical in content. It was identical in character, the same transmission duration, the same encryption architecture, the same approximate power output, the same behavioral pattern of originating exactly once and never repeating. Whatever was generating that signal, it was the same device. And whatever was behind that device was responsible for at least 3 events that her official records listed as having no responsible party. She didn't know what to do with this. She couldn't formally report a pattern she had assembled from unofficial notes. She couldn't cite herself as a source. So she did what analysts sometimes do when they have a finding they can't formally attribute. She named it informally in her own documentation, so she could refer to it consistently without writing lengthy descriptions each time. She called it Wraith. Just a word, her word. Private notation in a personal analytical document she kept on her secure workstation. On a Tuesday afternoon, she was preparing a summary of anomalous signals events for a routine monthly compilation that went to 3 different intelligence desks. She was tired. She had been on a 14-hour shift, and when she inserted a reference to the pattern she had been tracking, she used the shorthand she had created for herself. The document was reviewed, approved, and distributed with Wraith in it. It sat in 3 different inboxes before anyone noticed. The person who noticed was Major Callum Reardon, and he was already looking. Reardon was DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and he had spent the better part of 2 years pursuing what he suspected was a serious problem, a targeting program operating outside the established oversight architecture. He had no proof. He had only patterns, and patterns without attribution were professionally dangerous things to pursue. But 3 unexplained eliminations, all of high-value targets, all executed with a precision that exceeded anything publicly attributable, all logged as unknown, that was not coincidence. That was a system. Systems had origins. Reardon intended to find them. When Wraith appeared in the signal's summary, he recognized it immediately for what it was, not an officially designated asset, but a name someone had given a pattern, which meant someone else had noticed, which meant the pattern was real enough to name. He pulled Akafar's source document through proper channels. He read it twice. He printed it. He locked the printed copy in his desk safe and deleted the request from his access log through a legitimate administrative process he had used twice before for sensitive inquiries. Then he began working backward. He was methodical and patient, which were the qualities that made him good at this work, and also the qualities that sometimes made people uncomfortable around him. He called in favors from colleagues at 3 different agencies. He filed information requests using language precise enough to get results without triggering the defensive reflexes of the people he was requesting from. He spoke, over the course of 3 weeks, to 11 people who knew things they weren't saying and said things they didn't fully mean. None of them confirmed Wraith, but none of them dismissed the possibility in the clean, immediate way that people dismiss things that have no foundation. There was a pause before the deflections, a carefulness in the language, the particular verbal behavior of people navigating around something real. Reardon wrote 1 word in his personal notebook, confirmed. Then he started trying to find her. He didn't know she was a woman. He didn't know her rank or her unit or her name. He knew only that somewhere in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, there was a human being of extraordinary capability operating completely outside any accountability structure he could access, and that someone in a position of authority had authorized this and was protecting it. What he hadn't decided yet, what he was still working through in the careful way he worked through all difficult questions, was what exactly troubled him about that. The missions appeared to have been legitimate. The targets were genuine threats. The methodology, however unorthodox, had produced results that probably saved American lives. None of that was a crime. But accountability was not about preventing good outcomes. Accountability was about ensuring that the architecture which produced good outcomes also had the structural capacity to catch bad ones. A program that operated outside all oversight was a program that could drift, that could be misused, that could one day eliminate someone who was not a threat and leave no record that it had done so. That was what kept Reardon working late. That was what made him, when another burst transmission signature appeared in the signal's log 6 weeks after the Helios elimination, submit a tasking request to geographically locate its origin. The request was processed. The result came back, a 3-kilometer radius in eastern Afghanistan, consistent with elevated terrain. Reardon looked at the coordinates for a long time. He did not file the result officially. He did not share it, but he picked up his phone and made a call to a Delta Force element whose commanding officer he had worked with twice in the past 5 years. A man named Lieutenant Colonel Devereaux who was, Reardon had come to believe, someone capable of holding 2 contradictory obligations at once and navigating between them without losing either. The conversation was brief and indirect, which was how both men preferred to communicate. When it was over, Devereaux had agreed to nothing explicitly, but he had agreed. Reardon put down the phone. Somewhere in a mountain range the width of a continent, Elena Vasquez was breaking down a hide site she had occupied for 3 days, preparing to move to a safe house 60 kilometers north, completely unaware that a piece of paper with a word on it, a word she had never chosen, had never been given, had never used, had just begun to unravel everything. In Tehran, in a building that appeared on city maps as a regional telecommunications office, a signals analyst named Farhad Shirazi was doing what he did every morning, drinking tea, eating a piece of flatbread with white cheese, and reading a digest of intercepted American military communications that his team had flagged overnight. Most of it was routine. American military communications were heavily encrypted, and his team's ability to actually read the content was limited to a fraction of what they intercepted. But content was only part of the intelligence. Metadata, the fact of a communication, its timing, its origin, its destination, told its own story, and that story was often more useful than the words themselves. He almost missed it. It was a single-line reference in a secondary distribution document, a signals summary that had been forwarded through 2 intermediate nodes before it reached the feed his team monitored. The encryption had been partially degraded by a relay issue. The word was visible for exactly 1 sentence. Wraith. Shirazi circled it with a pencil and set the document aside. He spent the rest of the morning reviewing everything he could access about the surrounding context. The answer he arrived at was incomplete but suggestive. Wraith was a designator for an unknown asset responsible for at least 1 high-value elimination in the eastern provinces. Possibly more. He sent a 3-line report to his supervisor. The report moved upward quickly. Within 48 hours, it had reached a planning cell that specialized in exactly this kind of problem: the identification and neutralization of high-capability Western intelligence assets operating in the region. They had a budget, a network of human informants across 4 provinces, and the particular patience that comes from playing a long game. They began from the elimination sites, working backward through the human terrain, talking to shepherds, to village elders, to men who worked roads and moved goods and noticed things. They began assembling a picture, not of Alina specifically, of an absence, the particular absence left by someone extraordinarily good at leaving no trace. But absence has a shape A shepherd whose flock was disturbed by something he didn't see on a specific hillside. A local driver who noticed that the gravel on a certain road seemed recently disturbed in a way inconsistent with traffic. A family in a village near the car-caught elimination who had heard, in the night, the sound of careful footsteps that stopped when they listened. None of this was proof, all of it was direction. At a safe house in Kunar province, a man named Daud, who worked for the Iranian planning cell without knowing exactly who his information reached, compiled these fragments into a geographic profile. The asset moved through high terrain. The asset operated alone. The asset was extraordinarily patient and left almost nothing behind. Almost. They found the buried parachute. It had been in the streambed for 11 months, under 2 feet of gravel, and it had begun to degrade. The fabric was partially rotten, but the harness fittings were American military specification, and the packing technique, visible in the collapsed remains, was consistent with a HAHO military free-fall insertion. Dodd sent his report. The cell elevated its effort. 3 days later, the safe house that Alina had used 6 months prior, a room above a carpet merchant in a town she had visited exactly twice, for a combined total of 9 hours, the last time 7 months ago, was placed under surveillance. Alina was not there. She had not been there in 7 months, but surveillance of that location told the cell something crucial. Someone had established it. Someone had a support network, however minimal. Support networks left records and records left traces. At Bagram, in a secure compartmented facility that had no sign on its door, Colonel Hargrove was meeting with a communications analyst who had flagged something that did not look right. There was a pattern of increased human intelligence activity in 3 areas that overlapped with Alina's operational footprint. Specifically, informant networks that Hargrove's program had cultivated over 2 years were going quiet in a way that was not random. Random silence looks like static. This had a shape. It was moving from south to north, progressively, like a search front. Hargrove sat with this information for 4 hours. He ran the analysis 3 different ways and arrived at the same conclusion each time. Someone was looking for his asset, and they were getting closer. He sat at his desk for a long time after that. He thought about protocols, which told him to do nothing. Any communication outside established channels created risk. He thought about Alina, alone in the mountains with no awareness of what was moving toward her. He thought about the 3 previous intelligence assets who had been deployed against Helios. He thought about the one who had been found. He picked up a radio handset. He used a frequency they had never used for anything except tasking. He kept the transmission under 3 seconds. He said 7 words. Then he put the handset down and sat very still, because what he had just done existed in no protocol anywhere, and he was not certain it had been the right choice, and he was entirely certain it had been the necessary one. 300 kilometers away, in a position she had occupied for 2 days, Alina Vasquez heard 7 words through an earpiece she wore at all times, on a frequency she monitored but never transmitted on. The words were, "The mountain has eyes, move immediately." She was already packing. She moved at night the way she always moved, low, careful, deliberate. But this time there was a quality beneath the discipline that she had not often felt in 3 years of operations. Not panic. She was not capable of panic in any meaningful sense. But urgency, which is what panic becomes when it has been trained and directed and stripped of its hysteria. Hargrove's 7 words told her 3 things. First, someone knew approximately where she was. Second, the threat was proximate enough that her handler had broken his own protocol to warn her. Third, there was no extraction coming because an official extraction required official acknowledgement, and official acknowledgement meant exposing a program that had been built to be invisible. She was on her own. This was not new. She had always been on her own. What was new was the knowledge that someone was hunting her specifically, not stumbling across an American asset in a war zone, but actively, methodically pursuing the pattern she had spent 3 years trying not to leave. She chose her direction by elimination. The South was compromised. Hargrove's warning had come from indicators moving north to south, which meant the search front was below her. The East pushed her toward the Pakistani border, which introduced complications she didn't have the resources to manage. The West was open ground with insufficient cover for daylight movement. She went north, toward harder terrain, toward altitude, toward the kind of country that winnowed out the uncommitted by sheer physical attrition. For the first day, she moved well. The terrain was difficult but known. She had traversed this range twice before on separate missions, and had memorized its major features not from maps but from direct observation. She knew which slopes were unstable, which ridgelines were visible from the valley, which dry stream channels offered both concealment and directional drainage she could use for navigation in darkness. On the second day, she began to understand the shape of what was following her. She saw no one. That was the tell. In 3 years of operating in this country, Alina had never moved through populated terrain without encountering the normal human activity of the place: shepherds, farmers, children, the ordinary business of living. The valleys below her, which should have shown the smoke of morning cooking fires and the movement of goat flocks, were quiet. The people had been warned away. Someone had cleared the terrain ahead of a search operation with enough local authority and local knowledge to make it happen quietly. This was not the Taliban style. They would have mobilized fighters, created noise. This was someone who worked through the human infrastructure of the place without disturbing the surface. She had 2 days of food remaining, 1 day of water. Her body was carrying the accumulated cost of weeks of field operations. Not injury, but the quiet erosion of sustained physical stress, the kind that doesn't manifest as pain but as a slight thickening of response time, a small increase in the effort required to do things that should be automatic. On the third day, moving before dawn along a ridge that took her 400 meters above the valley floor, she made her assessment. The evasion was sustainable for perhaps another 48 hours before her physical condition began to materially degrade her operational capability. The search front behind her was professional, patient, and working with local knowledge she could not fully counter. She had no reinforcements, no resupply, and no extraction option that did not require officially acknowledging her existence. She had, in other words, run out of the conditions under which invisibility worked. She stopped walking. She sat down on a flat rock in the cold pre-dawn darkness and looked at the valley below her for a long time. She thought about Hargrove's instruction, the one rule above all others. You have no call sign, not ever, not in the field, not on comms, not to anyone. She thought about the 3 assets who had gone silent pursuing Helios. She thought about the one who had been found. She thought about the fact that she was still alive and still capable and still, despite everything, in a position to make a choice. She unslung the radio from her back. Not the burst transmission device. That was for reporting, not communication. And what she needed now was not to report but to reach. She extended the antenna. She tuned a frequency she had memorized years ago and never used, a frequency that Hargrove had given her during her first week of operational deployment, in the same conversation where he had told her she had no call sign, as a single exception to a rule with no other exceptions. If you are ever in a situation where silence will kill you, he had said, use this frequency, say your designation, once, and then you will either be found by the right people or the wrong ones, and you will have done everything you could. She keyed the radio. This is Wraith. I need extraction. I'm burning the route. 4 seconds of transmission. Then she released the key, turned off the radio, and began moving again, because staying still after a transmission was how people died. She did not know that Major Reardon's signals team picked it up in 90 seconds. She did not know that Lieutenant Colonel DeVert's Delta element, prepositioned in the province based on a conversation Reardon had held 3 weeks earlier, was already moving toward the transmission origin. She did not know that the hostile search cell, which had its own monitoring capability, had also heard it and was redirecting. She knew only that she had spoken her name into the open air for the first time in 3 years, and that whatever came next was no longer solely within her control. She moved faster. The mountain was very dark and very cold and very steep, and she climbed it with everything she had left. She reached the extraction point at 3:47 a.m. It was a flat stretch of road in a narrow valley, barely wide enough for a vehicle, hemmed in by rock walls on both sides, that she had identified from topographic study as the only helicopter-accessible ground within 5 kilometers. She had not been given this location as an extraction point. She had calculated it herself during 3 hours of movement in the dark, working backward from the capabilities of the assets she hoped were responding and the terrain constraints of her position. She found a low rock wall running along the valley's eastern edge, dropped behind it, and immediately went still and silent. She slowed her breathing. She scanned. 11 minutes passed. She heard the delta element before she saw them, not their footsteps, which were professional and nearly inaudible, but the slight change in ambient sound that comes when human bodies move through a space and displace the small nocturnal activity of the place. The crickets, the air, nothing dramatic, just the world briefly reorganizing itself around the presence of people. She counted 6 heat signatures through her scope before she heard Devereux's voice, low, careful, carrying the precise enunciation of someone trying to communicate clearly without raising volume. Transmission origin, single occupant, identify. She stood up from behind the rock wall. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, the particular silence of trained men encountering something that does not match their expectation. Then Devereux said quietly, "Well." Nothing else. Just that one word, carrying in it the compression of whatever assumptions he had been carrying about what Wraith was, now meeting what Wraith actually was. She said, "South access is compromised. There may be 4 kilometers out." Devereux looked at her for one more second, then turned to his element and began issuing instructions without any further discussion of who or what she was. This was professionalism at its finest, the ability to update a model and act on the update without needing to process it emotionally first. The extraction helicopter came in dark and fast, without lights, navigation strobes off, flaring hard at the last moment to bleed speed before the skids touched the road. The pilot was very good. The whole thing lasted 40 seconds. They were airborne before the search cell reached the valley floor. Alina sat against the helicopter's interior wall with her rifle across her knees and let herself feel, briefly and privately, the specific relief of a person who has been living at the edge of what their body can sustain and has just, provisionally, stepped back from it. Not safe. She was not naive enough to think she was safe, but alive, and in the company of people whose purpose was aligned with hers, and moving away from the thing that had been moving toward her. Devereux sat across from her and said nothing for the first 10 minutes of flight. He was a large, quiet man with the particular stillness of someone who had spent many years in difficult situations and had learned that silence was not the absence of thought but a form of respect. Eventually he said, "Anyone know you were out there?" "My handler," she said, "and now you." He nodded once, accepting this, and looked out the window. Major Reardon was waiting at Bagram. She had known he would be. When Devereux had used the word Reardon twice during the flight, in the context of the operation, she had understood the basic architecture of what had happened. Someone had been investigating the program, had found enough of the shape of it to position assets, and had chosen to use that positioning to extract rather than apprehend. That was an interesting choice. She had spent the last 30 minutes of the flight thinking about what it meant. Reardon was smaller than she had imagined, for no reason she could have articulated. He was maybe 45, with the kind of face that was neither remarkable nor forgettable, the ideal face for the kind of work he did. He was holding a file folder that he put down on a table in the secure room before he extended his hand. She shook it. They sat down across from each other, and for a moment neither spoke, and the silence was the particular kind that exists between two people who have been moving in parallel toward each other for a long time, and have only now actually arrived in the same room. The program is legal, Reardon said, not as an accusation, as a statement of something he had confirmed. The authorization exists, the oversight structure exists, I found it. I know, Elena said. I spent 2 years looking because I didn't know, he said. That's the problem. Something that's legitimate shouldn't be this hard to find. She considered this. It was a fair point, delivered without antagonism, and it deserved a fair response. The visibility is the vulnerability, she said. The program works because nobody knows it exists, including people like you. Including people like me, he agreed. And that's a reasonable operational security argument. It's also the argument every unaccountable program makes. They sat with that for a moment. Wraith, she said finally. It was strange saying it aloud. It had belonged to Reardon's investigation for weeks. She now understood it had never been hers. Where did that come from? He told her about Akafar, the exhausted analyst with the private notes and the unfortunate habit of thoroughness. Elena listened without expression, but she filed the name away, not for any professional reason, simply because it seemed right to know the name of the person whose accidental act of clarity had changed the shape of her existence. The word is in a document, Reardon said, a document that moved through a compromised feed. That's how they found the pattern. That's how the search started. I know, she said again. The call sign you used tonight, he said carefully. Wraith, it's not in any official record. No, she said. So who gave it to you? Nobody, she said. I gave it to myself 3 hours ago when I decided to speak. Reardon looked at her for a long moment. Why that word? She thought about it. Because I heard it on the frequency before I transmitted. Someone used it to describe the signal pattern. It seemed appropriate. What she did not say, because it was not something she fully had the language for yet, was the rest of it. The fact that in the 3 years she had spent being invisible, she had sometimes, in the long, silent hours of a hindsight, in the particular aloneness of a person who has chosen to have no name in the world, wondered what it would cost her in the end. Not operationally, personally. What it cost a human being to exist for years as though they did not. She had found her answer in the moment she keyed the radio. It had cost her exactly this. One sentence, spoken in a dark mountain valley, that brought the right people and not the wrong ones. That was the calculation she had made, and the calculation had been correct, and it had been correct because she had spent 3 years becoming someone whose judgment, applied in the worst possible circumstances, still held. Hargrove arrived at dawn. He came through the door without ceremony, looked at her once, and she could see in his face the thing that people feel when they have made a decision under enormous uncertainty, and the decision has resolved in the right direction. He said nothing about the warning he had sent, neither did she. Some things are acknowledged through silence more completely than through words. The program continued. Wraith was formally retired from all documentation. Akafar's original file was reclassified and relocated through 3 administrative layers until it would take someone with Reardon's specific determination to find it again. A new operational designation was created, buried deeper than anything that had come before, in a compartment within a compartment. The oversight architecture that Reardon had spent 2 years demanding was quietly restructured, not eliminated, not exposed, but made real in a form that satisfied his concerns without compromising the program's essential nature. He was brought into a circle of awareness he had never been meant to enter, because the alternative was a man with sufficient intelligence and determination operating outside that circle, which had already proven to be dangerous. Elena Vasquez flew back to the mountains 3 days later. She entered the landscape the way she always had, alone, invisible, carrying nothing that could be traced. The mission package arrived as numbers, decoded through a fresh pad, committed to memory and burned. The difference was internal and invisible to anyone who might have observed her, and very real. She had spoken her name into the darkness. The darkness had answered correctly. She had returned to silence not because she had no other choice but because she understood, now more completely than she ever had, exactly what the silence was for. It was not invisibility for its own sake. It was not the erasure of a self. It was a deliberate, chosen form of discipline, the willingness to set down the ordinary human need to be known, for as long as the work required it, and then to pick it up again when the work was done. She moved through the mountain terrain with the unhurried certainty of someone who knows exactly where she is going. The next mission was waiting. She went.